I never thought the worst humiliation of my life would come wrapped in roses, crystal chandeliers, and a microphone in my sister's hand. And the part that haunts me most is that for a few seconds, I still hoped she'd say something kind. The words echo in my head as I stand rooted beneath the dazzling glow of the Fairmont Hotel ballroom in San Francisco. The place hums with a restless, expensive energy. Golden chandeliers spill diamonds of light onto marble floors. Crystal glasses chime like tiny bells as waiters slip between clusters of guests. It smells of white roses, melted wax, and the faint tang of expensive perfume mixed with nervous sweat. And me. I'm standing there, tugging at the seams of my rented navy satin dress, trying not to wrinkle it more than it already is. My hair's swept up into a careful twist, a style I practiced 4 times that morning until my arms ached, but a stubborn strand keeps falling across my cheek, like it's trying to hide me from the world. Ethan, my 8-year-old son, stands beside me, clutching the edge of my dress like it's a lifeline. His little suit is pressed and clean, though I can't stop glancing at the faint chocolate stain on his sleeve that I failed to scrub out completely. "Mom, does this mean Aunt Sabrina's a princess now?" he whispers, voice breathless. I manage a small laugh, though it wobbles in my chest. "Sort of, baby, just with a bigger Instagram following." He nods solemnly, as though that explains everything. I want to protect his wonder, to let him keep believing this night is magical. Instead of the silent war I feel humming beneath the glitter. Across the ballroom, Sabrina glides between tables. She's a vision in a dress that looks poured over her skin, soft white satin hugging her frame, sequins catching the light like frost on glass. Her blonde hair sweeps down one shoulder in perfect, glossy waves. Every few steps, someone reaches for her hand, kisses her cheek, tells her she looks radiant. And she does. But beneath her perfect smile, there's a sharpness in her eyes tonight, something I can't quite name. Because here's what no one else sees. Sabrina's always known how to play the room. She can pivot from sweetness to ice in a single blink. And though the world knows her as the sweet influencer with 500,000 followers, the girl next door with sponsored posts and sunlit selfies, I've seen her wield her words like scalpels. I've been on the receiving end too many times to count. She used to leave sticky notes in my locker at school. "No one likes a know-it-all." She'd whisper secrets into crowds that always somehow circled back to me. But sometimes, late at night, when she'd crawl into my bed crying after our parents' screaming matches, I'd hold her and promise we'd always look out for each other. Even now, part of me clings to that memory. Part of me still wants to believe she might look my way and offer a real olive branch instead of a dagger. But as she laughs and throws her head back under the chandeliers, I can feel the tension tightening in the pit of my stomach. My mother, Deborah, stands near the head table, flawless in emerald green silk. Her lips are painted the color of bruised plums, and every line of her posture screams elegance and warning. She's locked onto Sabrina like she's watching her final, perfect masterpiece unfold. She doesn't even glance my way. Ethan tugs on my dress again. "Mom, why's everyone staring at us?" My eyes sting. I blink hard. "They're just curious, sweetheart." He looks unconvinced, twisting the hem of his suit jacket between his fingers. I slip an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close, because the truth is, in this ballroom, every stare feels like a quiet question. "Why are you here?" I check my place card for the 3rd time. Table 23. Shoved behind a marble pillar, practically brushing the swing door to the restrooms, I force a brittle laugh. Of course. Sabrina's voice floats across the ballroom, her laughter bright as cut glass. She tilts her head and catches my eye for a single, charged second. Her lips curve into a small, knowing smile, the kind she used to flash at me right before she said something that would shatter me. The string quartet swells into a soft crescendo. I know she's about to speak. I know this room is about to tilt on its axis. And despite everything, some tiny traitorous part of me still hopes my sister might surprise me tonight. When I was little, I used to believe families were like snow globes' perfect little worlds, safe under glass. No cracks, no secrets, just swirling glitter. It took me longer than it should have to realize. Our family was nothing like that. My parents raised us in Palo Alto, in a house with tall windows and the kind of white picket fence that seemed designed for glossy holiday cards. But inside, it always felt tight. My mother, Julia Carson, was the kind of woman who believed in appearances so fiercely. She might have traded oxygen for reputation if she could have. She had rules for everything: how you sat, how you spoke, even how wide you were allowed to smile in family photos. Sabrina thrived in that world, 5 years younger than me. She was born with a halo around her head, or so it seemed. Blonde hair, eyes the color of a summer sky, a laugh that made strangers stop and stare. By the time she was 10, she was in print ads for department stores. By 16, she had local news reporters calling her the next big thing. Mom soaked it up like sunlight. Our house became a revolving door of photographers and agents and friends who wanted a selfie with Sabrina. Meanwhile, I disappeared. Not physically, I was always there, helping clean up the catering trays, pressing Sabrina's dresses, standing in doorways while people complimented my sister and then forgot my name. But emotionally, it was like fading into wallpaper. My dad used to tell me I was the smart one. He'd say, "Jules, you're the thinker. Your sister might get the spotlight, but you'll build something real." He left when I was 10, packed his bags while Mom was at a charity gala and never came back. Sabrina cried herself sick that night. I curled up beside her in bed, trying to hush the sound of her sobs. She was so small then. She smelled like baby shampoo and bubble gum. "I'll always protect you," I whispered, "no matter what." I meant it. But as we grew older, that closeness cracked. Sabrina learned how to wield charm like a weapon. She started mocking the way I dressed, the books I loved, the weight I couldn't quite keep off. At school, she'd smile sweetly in public, then slip me notes calling me a loser, or worse, invisible. By high school, we barely spoke unless she wanted something. Even so, a part of me kept hoping we'd find our way back to being sisters. That hope flickered bright when I got into Stanford. Literature major. Partial scholarship. My acceptance letter felt like freedom pressed into paper. I told Mom at dinner, hands shaking with excitement. She didn't even look up from her wine glass. "How will you pay for the rest?" she asked. Sabrina, 17 and already with sponsorship deals rolling in, said, "Jules, just marry someone rich. College is overrated." Mom laughed at that. 2 months later, I met Chris Madden. He was older, confident, drove a vintage Mustang, and told me I was beautiful when my hair was a mess and my eyes were tired. I fell so hard so fast. By 25, I was pregnant, convinced we'd get married, buy a house, build a life. Chris vanished in my 5th month. One morning I woke up, his toothbrush gone, closet empty, phone disconnected. Mom didn't cry. She sat me down at the kitchen table, poured herself coffee, and said, "Well, I suppose now you'll understand what happens when you let men make promises." No one offered to help. No one asked me if I was scared. Instead, Mom told anyone who'd listen that I'd chosen a difficult path. And Sabrina. She didn't call. She didn't show up at the hospital when Ethan was born. She posted a photo that week in a gold sequin dress, captioned, "Big things coming, stay tuned." I stared at that picture, lying in my hospital bed, stitches aching, my baby asleep beside me, and felt something inside me splinter, but I didn't let it break me. I took Ethan home to our tiny apartment in the Mission District. I found work pouring lattes for bleary-eyed commuters in the morning, then checking in weary travelers at a hotel front desk at night. Some days, exhaustion felt like a second skin. But then, Ethan would wrap his little arms around my neck and whisper, "You're my superhero, Mommy." And I'd remember why I kept going. Still, the silent judgment never left. Mom never stopped reminding me that Sabrina's wedding was a chance to repair the Carson family image. And that's why, when the invitation arrived, thick cream cardstock, gold foil edges, I almost tore it up. It was addressed to Julia Carson, not Julia. Just one more reminder that even on paper, I didn't quite fit, but Ethan begged me to go. "Mom, I want to see Aunt Sabrina's castle." So I said yes. Because sometimes, even if you know you're walking into the lion's den, you go anyway, just to prove to yourself that you're not afraid anymore. The morning of Sabrina's wedding dawned sharp and blue, like the city itself was trying to scrub away any trace of the fog that usually clings to San Francisco's streets. Sunlight poured through our apartment windows, lighting up dust motes floating in the air as Ethan danced around the living room, still in his Star Wars pajamas. "Mom, do you think Aunt Sabrina will have a cake shaped like a castle?" I tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin. "Probably, honey. Maybe with sparklers on top?" He gasped, eyes shining. "Sparklers are my favorite." I stared at him for a long moment, fighting back an ache in my chest. Part of me wanted to tell him we didn't belong there, that it wasn't really our world. But his hope felt too pure to crush. In the bathroom, steam curled around the mirror as I pinned my hair into soft twists. My hands trembled each time I tried to secure another bobby pin. I kept replaying how I'd explain my presence to people who might pretend not to remember my name. The navy satin dress I rented hung from the door. I slipped it on carefully, smoothing the fabric over my hips, trying to convince myself it looked elegant rather than desperate. When I stepped out, Ethan stopped mid-spin, his mouth forming a perfect, "Oh, Mom, you look like a movie star." His words nearly cracked something open inside me. I knelt in front of him, straightened his tiny tie, and swallowed the lump in my throat. "You're my best guy, you know that." He grinned, missing front tooth and all. At the Fairmont, the doormen wore bright red jackets, polished brass buttons gleaming. They held open the massive doors like they were welcoming royalty. The lobby smelled of fresh lilies and polished marble, sunlight pouring in through tall arched windows. Ethan's fingers squeezed mine so tightly it almost hurt. "Is this a palace?" "Feels like one," I whispered. Inside the ballroom, the air was thick with perfume and chatter. People stood in glittering clusters, all flawless makeup and tailored suits, the kind of crowd who moved through the world like it owed them a favor. Ethan craned his neck, eyes huge, absorbing every detail. "Mom, everyone's so shiny." I followed his gaze. Women in gowns the color of precious stones, men adjusting cufflinks that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Near the head table, Sabrina sparkled like the epicenter of it all. Her dress was different now, a sleek column of white silk, delicate beading catching every flicker of light. She laughed, leaning in close to a man in a designer suit. Her smile bright, but her eyes scanning the room like she was counting who was watching. She saw me. For a split second, something crossed her face, surprise, relief, regret. Then her features slid back into place, and she tilted her chin. "You actually came," she said, each word floating over the space between us like a tiny poisonous gift. "I told you I would," I answered, voice softer than I intended. She flicked a glance at Ethan, who offered her a shy wave. "He's gotten so big," Sabrina murmured, her lips stretching into a polite smile. No hug, no warmth, just a fleeting acknowledgement. And then she turned away, swept back into a tide of congratulations and camera flashes. I stood there, my heart thudding, realizing how quickly my sister could erase me from her world. A hotel coordinator with a clipboard guided us through the ballroom. "Miss Carson, your table's this way." She led us toward the far corner, behind a massive marble pillar and perilously close to the swinging doors to the restrooms. "Table 23. I sank into my chair, blinking hard as I took in the view, mostly the backs of people's heads and a waiter station stacked with extra glasses. Ethan climbed into his chair, legs too short to touch the floor, and whispered, "Mom? Why are we sitting all the way back here?" I forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "Because sometimes people don't know where to put us." He stared at me, unblinking. "Well, I'm glad we're here anyway." The string quartet struck up a new melody, high and sweet, as Sabrina drifted past again, trailed by a photographer snapping endless shots. I tried to convince myself I could survive a few hours, but deep down, a voice curled around my ribs, cold and certain, warning me that tonight wasn't going to be just another party. And as the laughter rose and glasses clinked, I felt the edges of my world tighten, bracing for the moment my sister would decide it was time to speak. The music faded into a gentle hush as Sabrina stepped up to the microphone, framed by tall arrangements of white orchids and shimmering candles. Every head turned toward her like flowers seeking the sun. She held the mic lightly, the diamond bracelet on her wrist glinting like ice. For a moment, she simply scanned the room, a soft smile playing on her lips. "It means everything to me that you're all here tonight," she began, her voice as smooth as silk. "To celebrate the most important day of my life, surrounded by those I love." A soft wave of applause rippled through the crowd. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, hoping she'd keep it simple. But I should have known better. Sabrina's smile sharpened like a knife. "There's someone else I'd like to talk about tonight." My heart lurched. "I want to say something about my sister, Julia." 100 faces turned toward me. My pulse roared in my ears. Sabrina tilted her head, adopting the gentle, almost reverent tone she uses in her sponsored skincare videos. "Julia's always been an example for me." A hesitant laugh bubbled from one of the front tables. Unsure whether this was comedy or confession, "She's taught me what it looks like to survive, even when you've made choices that leave you alone." I froze, the tips of my fingers going numb. Sabrina leaned closer to the mic, her voice softening until it almost sounded kind. "I mean, raising a child all by yourself, working all those hours, smiling at strangers who probably don't even tip you properly. That takes guts." A ripple of uneasy laughter shivered through the ballroom. Ethan's hand tightened around mine so hard my knuckles ached. "Mom, why's Aunt Sabrina talking like that?" he whispered, eyes wide. I couldn't answer him. Sabrina pressed on, her voice growing silkier with every word. "And let's be real. We all know it's not easy for some women to keep a man around." Laughter erupted, louder this time, rolling through the tables like thunder. I wanted to vanish. But Sabrina wasn't finished. She lifted a perfectly manicured hand and let it flutter through the air as if brushing away invisible dust. Still, she showed up tonight, sat way in the back, all by herself, wearing that very nice dress. So let's give her a round of applause for being, what's the word? She paused, pretending to search for it, her eyes locking onto mine. Resilient! The applause started hesitantly, then picked up, filling the room with a brittle sound that made my skin crawl. Some people clapped awkwardly, others laughed behind their hands. Deborah, standing near the front, leaned toward the couple beside her and said, "Just loud enough to carry." Well, a used car can still look shiny if you polish it enough. More laughter, sharper this time. The kind that doesn't just sting, it slices. My breath turned shallow, chest heaving. I wanted to stand, to scream, to tell every person in that room that they didn't know me, that they didn't know how many nights I'd sat awake figuring out how to keep the lights on, how to keep Ethan fed, how to keep smiling when I wanted to crumble. But all I could do was sit there, nailed to my chair. My eyes burned as I glanced at Ethan. He was staring at Sabrina, confusion and hurt battling across his face. He whispered, voice trembling, "Mom, did you do something bad?" I felt like my entire soul cracked in half. Around us, people were laughing, sipping champagne, pretending they were witnessing harmless humor instead of watching my dignity being stripped away piece by piece. Some guests looked embarrassed, glancing down into their glasses. A few avoided my eyes altogether. Grandpa Norman, who used to lift me onto his shoulders and call me his little lion, sat motionless at his table, staring down at his folded hands. It was as if everyone decided at once that looking at me was too awkward or too dangerous. Sabrina smiled brightly, as if she'd just wrapped a heartfelt toast. To Julia, the strongest woman I know. She raised her glass high, and the room echoed her gesture. I felt my stomach twist, bile creeping into my throat. I wanted to bolt from the ballroom, to scoop Ethan into my arms and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I sat frozen as Sabrina lowered the microphone, still smiling, and in that suspended moment, under the blazing lights and the glittering chandeliers, I realized the most painful truth of all. That, even after everything, some part of me still hoped she'd love me. A hush hung in the air like the split second before glass shatters. Then a chair scraped back so violently it shrieked against the marble floor. Heads whipped toward the sound. Champagne sloshed in glasses. The violinists stilled mid-note. Derek Collins, Sabrina's fiancé, stood slowly at the head table. He looked different in that moment. Not just polished and handsome, but like a man carrying something heavy he couldn't put down. His jaw worked, his chest rising and falling as though he was trying to calm a storm that had been brewing far longer than tonight. Sabrina turned to him, her voice bright, brittle. "Derek, what are you doing?" But he didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. Instead, his eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, I thought he might deliver another joke, diffuse the tension, smooth it all over the way people always do in my family. But he didn't. He reached out his hand, and the wedding coordinator hesitated only a second before handing him the microphone. Derek's voice was quiet at first, so quiet the entire ballroom leaned forward as one. "I didn't plan on speaking tonight." A nervous laugh sputtered from somewhere near the front. Derek ignored it. He lifted his gaze, sweeping it across the guests. "But I can't stand here and watch this happen." Sabrina let out a shaky laugh, fingers trembling around the stem of her champagne flute. "Derek, it was just a joke." "No." He cut her off, his voice growing firmer, steel edging into each word. "No. Sabrina, that wasn't a joke. That was public humiliation. And I can't pretend it's okay." Gasps rippled through the room. A man near the bar set his drink down a little too hard, ice rattling. Derek kept talking, his voice unwavering. "I've spent the past year listening to people talk about family, about loyalty, about appearances. But what I just saw, that's not family. That's cruelty. And I refuse to stand by and let it slide, because someone's wearing a white dress and everyone thinks that means they're untouchable." Sabrina's mouth opened, closed. Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for someone to rescue her. But no one moved. Derek looked back at me, and for the first time I saw something fierce in his eyes, a kind of anger, born not of hatred, but of heartbreak. Julia didn't ask to be mocked. She didn't come here looking for pity. She came to support her sister, even after everything. And what did she get? Laughter, whispers, 1,000 eyes watching her like she was a sideshow. His voice cracked then, just a hair. My mother was a single mom. He said, "Softer now." I watched her work herself raw. I watched people judge her, talk behind her back, tell her she was damaged goods. and I swore I'd never let that kind of cruelty pass as comedy. Not ever. The ballroom had gone utterly silent. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Derek turned to Sabrina, voice trembling but strong. "You think humiliating your sister in front of everyone makes you look powerful? It doesn't. It makes you look small." Sabrina let out a choked sound, eyes glistening. For the first time all night, she looked human. Not the flawless influencer. Not the social media queen. Just a girl whose perfectly curated world was cracking at the edges. Derek inhaled deeply. "So if marrying you means becoming part of this family, a family that would sit silent while this happens, then I can't do it." A collective gasp rose, high and sharp. Sabrina reached for his arm. "Derek, please. You're overreacting." He stepped back from her touch like it burned. "I'd rather leave here alone than spend my life pretending cruelty is love." He pulled the ring box from his pocket and placed it gently on the edge of the table. The weight of that tiny velvet box seemed to ripple outward, hitting every corner of the ballroom. Then he looked at Ethan, who was staring up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. "Hey, buddy." Derek's voice softened. "Don't ever let anyone tell you your mom's less than amazing. You hear me?" Ethan nodded, wordless. Derek held my gaze one final time. And in it, I saw something I hadn't felt in years. Validation. Respect. He turned and strode out of the ballroom. The heavy doors swung closed behind him with a soft, echoing thud. No one clapped. No one moved. Sabrina stood frozen, her flawless facade splintering, breath coming in shallow bursts. Deborah reached for her, but Sabrina pulled away, eyes darting wildly, as if she couldn't comprehend how the night had flipped so completely. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel small. The silence that followed Derek's exit hung heavy, as though the chandeliers themselves were embarrassed to keep sparkling. People began to move in slow, uncertain waves, gathering coats and murmuring to each other. Eyes darting toward Sabrina, and then away. Ethan and I slipped out quietly, the cool night air outside the Fairmont biting at my flushed cheeks. He held my hand like he thought I might float away. "Mom, is the wedding over?" I swallowed, searching the glitter of city lights for the right words. "Yeah, baby. I think it ended a little early, on the ride home." Ethan leaned against my shoulder, quiet and pensive. When we got back to our apartment, he went straight to his room without asking for his usual bedtime story. I tucked him in and lingered at the doorway longer than usual, just watching his chest rise and fall. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Again, and again, and again. I picked it up with trembling fingers, already dreading the notifications. At first, it was texts from numbers I didn't know. Then links started pouring in. A shaky video played on my screen. Derek, standing tall, voice echoing across the ballroom. "I'd rather leave here alone than spend my life pretending cruelty is love." The clip cut to me sitting at table 23, eyes wide, Ethan gripping my arm. Overlaid text flashed in bold white letters. "Groom calls off wedding to defend single mom, hero, or drama king." My stomach lurched as I watched the view counter rocket up. 50,000, 80,000, 100,000. Then the comments rolled in. "This man is a legend. Protect single moms at all costs. Sabrina is cancelled. I've never cried this hard watching a TikTok." Another video surfaced. Someone else had captured Sabrina's entire speech, laughter echoing through the audio. My face flickered across the screen, frozen, mid-shock. It felt like watching my own humiliation on a loop. Part of me wanted to throw my phone across the room, but another part couldn't stop watching. Because buried between all the internet gawkers were messages from women I'd never met. "I've been that single mom at the family table. Thank you for staying strong. I felt invisible my whole life. Until now." My chest tightened reading them. In the days that followed, Sabrina tried to spin the narrative. She posted a series of pastel-colored Instagram stories. Sometimes humor doesn't land the way we intend. I love my sister, and I wish her nothing but happiness. Let's move forward with kindness. But her follower count started to drop. Brands that used to tag her in sponsored posts went silent. A popular YouTuber did a reaction video titled, "Why Sabrina Carson's Wedding Speech Wasn't Just a Joke." Comments exploded beneath it. Even people who didn't know me started speaking up, saying this wasn't about a single wedding. It was about how society treats women who step off the so-called right path. One woman messaged me, "My mother was a single mom too. People said horrible things. I wish someone like Derek had spoken up for her." I didn't know how to respond to any of it. Everywhere I went, strangers recognized me. At the grocery store, a woman touched my arm and said, "You're braver than you think." At the coffee shop, my coworker grinned and whispered, "The single mom squad is rooting for you." It felt unreal, like the world had cracked open and let sunlight spill in where there'd only been shadows before. One morning, a talk show producer called. She wanted me to come on the air, share my viral story. But I said no. I wasn't looking for fame. I just wanted my quiet life back. Still, there were moments, late at night, when I sat in the dark living room and rewatched Derek's speech. Not because I wanted the attention, but because I needed to remind myself it really happened. That someone finally stood up and said, "Enough." And even though I'd always believed I was alone, I realized I wasn't. Not anymore. Weeks passed, the viral frenzy fading the way all internet storms eventually do. But my life felt different. Every morning, I still woke up to the hiss of the coffee pot, the hum of early buses outside our window. Ethan still begged for dinosaur-shaped pancakes, and my bank account still winced at the price of rent in San Francisco. But something inside me had shifted, like a bone set back into place after years out of joint. I started walking into rooms with my head higher. I stopped apologizing for existing, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the family's cautionary tale. People still recognized me sometimes. At the hotel front desk, a woman leaned close and whispered, "I saw that video. You're incredible." At Ethan's school, another mom gave me a thumbs up from across the parking lot. But it wasn't fame I felt. It was solidarity. A quiet understanding that even strangers could look at me and say, "I've been there too." Ethan kept talking about Derek. He'd run around our tiny apartment, brandishing his plastic shield like Captain America. "Not today!" Bullies, he'd shout, startling our downstairs neighbors. Sometimes, though, he'd grow quiet. One evening, as we were brushing our teeth, he paused, blue foam dripping down his chin. "Mom, do you think Derek's sad?" I blinked at our reflections in the mirror. "I think sometimes doing the right thing makes you lonely for a while." He nodded solemnly. "I hope he knows he's still a hero." My heart squeezed so tight it almost hurt. Later that week, an email arrived that made my breath catch. It was from Stanford. A polite, simple message inviting me to resume my studies if I wanted. I stared at it for a long time, fingers trembling over the keyboard. For so many years, college had felt like a door slammed shut. Something for other people. People who hadn't made mistakes. But now, I couldn't stop imagining it. Late-night study sessions, libraries smelling of old paper, my name on a diploma, a different kind of future. I showed Ethan the email. His face lit up. "Does this mean you'll have homework too?" I laughed. "Yep, tons of it." He gave a fierce little nod. "Good, you're gonna be awesome." I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how I'd juggle work, parenting, and school, but for the first time in years, I wanted to try. At night, sometimes I'd think about Derek. I heard he moved out of the apartment he'd shared with Sabrina, that he was staying somewhere closer to the coast, working cases pro bono for single mothers dealing with custody battles. Part of me wanted to call him, to say thank you, to ask how he was, maybe even to see if he wanted to grab coffee. But I also knew some wounds needed time to breathe, so I held back. Instead, I carried the memory of his voice like a shield around my ribs. One evening, Ethan and I stood on a hill overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. The sky streaked pink and orange. He slipped his hand into mine. "Mom, are you glad you went to Aunt Sabrina's wedding?" I took a deep breath, the wind cool on my face. "Yeah, baby, I think I needed to, even though it was awful." I looked down at his small, serious face. "Even though it was awful," I said softly, "because sometimes the only way to change your story is to walk right into the place that tried to break you." He thought about that for a long moment, then squeezed my hand. "I think you're the bravest person I know." And under the fading sunlight, with the bay shimmering like molten gold, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. I knew life wouldn't magically be easy, but I finally believed it could still be mine. If there's one truth I wish I could tattoo across my own skin, it's this. People will always try to define you by your worst moment. They'll take the pieces of your story. They think they understand the mistakes, the labels, the secrets, and spin them into a narrative that suits their comfort. But they don't get to decide who you are. I spent years believing I was less. That being a single mom meant I'd failed. That my life had veered off some perfect map everyone else seemed to follow. But the night in that ballroom, as humiliating as it was, ripped off the last layer of my fear. It forced me to see the truth I'd been trying to hide from myself. I am not the sum of other people's whispers. I am not a cautionary tale. And my son deserves to see a mother who knows her worth. Sabrina used to be my measure of success, the person I thought I needed to catch up to, or become. But in the aftermath of that night, I started to understand something I never expected. Sabrina's perfect world was fragile. Behind her curated smiles and perfect photos, she's still the same girl who crawled into my bed crying when we were kids, afraid our father wasn't coming home. She's messy, flawed, and probably more lost than she lets on. I don't know if we'll ever be close again, but I've stopped waiting for her approval to feel whole. I've stopped waiting for my mother's too, because the love I needed was my own. Ethan asks me sometimes if I'm still mad at Aunt Sabrina. I tell him no, not because I've forgotten, or because what she did was okay, but because holding on to anger would keep me tethered to the very people who tried to shrink me. Forgiveness, I'm learning, isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. So if you're listening to this, and you've ever felt small or invisible, or convinced your story was something to be ashamed of, hear me when I say, your voice matters, your story matters. You deserve to take up space. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is refuse to let anyone else write your ending. Life doesn't always tie itself up with neat satin bows. Some relationships stay broken. Some wounds leave scars. But that doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human. And you're still worthy of joy. So stand up. Speak your truth. Even if your voice shakes. Because somewhere out there, someone's waiting to hear your story so they know they're not alone. And if I've learned anything, it's that sometimes the ending you deserve isn't a perfect fairy tale. It's simply walking away with your head held high, finally, unapologetically yourself.